The fluorescent lights hummed, their monotonous song as Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway of room 412, his heart heavy with the weight of 5 consecutive double shifts. His white coat bore the stains of a career-defining week, coffee, spilled during a midnight crisis, a smudge of antiseptic from a procedure that didn't go as planned, and the invisible residue of every patient he'd failed to save. At 28, Marcus had already learned that medicine was less about science and more about bearing witness to the fragility of human existence. But nothing had prepared him for Catherine Delacroix. She lay there like a sculpture in a gallery dedicated to suffering, perfectly still, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, thanks to the ventilator that had become her lifeline. Expensive silk pajamas had been replaced by a hospital gown. Her platinum blonde hair now stringy and matted, her face swollen from weeks of inactivity. The monitors around her bed beeped their endless chorus, a digital requiem that played day and night. Catherine had been in a coma for 37 days. A car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. One moment of distraction, a text message glance, and a California billionaire's world had stopped entirely. The nurses had warned Marcus about her. "Don't get attached, Jackie," the lead RN on the ICU floor had said with the jaded wisdom of someone who'd seen too many wealthy patients with too many expensive problems. Her family barely visits. The lawyers are arguing about power of attorney. And honestly, the prognosis isn't great. The detachment in Jackie's voice wasn't cruelty, it was armor. That's what long-term care wards did to people. They made you clinical, efficient, emotionally bulletproof. But Marcus had never been good at that. He noticed that Catherine's bandages hadn't been changed since the night shift. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that the exhausted staff could easily overlook. One more task on an impossible list. The bandage on her left arm, where the IV line had begun to irritate the skin, was slightly blood-stained at the edges. Her right hand, immobilized for protection, had developed the beginning of a pressure sore. These were wounds of neglect, the kind that turn tragedy into trauma, that transform a patient's body into a landscape of suffering. Marcus pulled a chair over to the side of her bed and sat down, something he knew violated the unspoken hospital protocol about emotional investment. He spent the next hour methodically changing her bandages, not with the hurried efficiency of routine, but with the tenderness you might show a sleeping child. He cleaned each wound with saline solution, applied fresh gauze with careful precision, and repositioned her hands to prevent further damage. As he worked, he spoke to her about his day, about his mother's rose garden back in Nashville, about how he'd become a doctor because of his grandmother, who died when he was 12 from something preventable, something that wouldn't have happened if she'd had better access to care. "I don't know if you can hear me," he whispered while taping down fresh gauze. "I don't know if any of this matters, but I want you to know that someone sees you. You're not just a chart in the system, not just a statistic of survival rates and prognoses. You're a human being and you deserve to be treated like one." The monitors didn't change. Catherine remained suspended in that terrible liminal space between life and death, her consciousness locked away behind the walls of her own nervous system. Marcus didn't expect anything to happen. He returned to his rotation, worked another impossible shift, and tried to convince himself that his gesture had meant nothing, that it was just a small act of kindness in a profession built on futility. But 3 days later, something changed. It started small, a flutter in her EEG, a slight increase in responsiveness when the doctor performed neurological tests. Within a week, Catherine's eyes began to move beneath their lids. The family, suddenly present and energized by renewed hope, crowded the room with lawyers and private physicians. But it was Marcus who noticed the moment her pupils responded to light, who caught the moment when her hand involuntarily squeezed his own. When Catherine woke up fully, 45 days after the accident, her first word was slurred and confused. But her eyes were awake, alert, aware. The machines became less necessary. The family became less frantic. And then came the moment that changed everything. Catherine recovered faster than anyone expected. The physical therapy was grueling, the cognitive rehabilitation patience testing. But her determination was fierce. Within 3 months, she was walking. Within 6, she was back in her corporate offices, running her tech empire with the same ruthless efficiency that had made her a fortune. The doctors couldn't explain it entirely sometimes, they said. The body possesses mysteries we don't fully understand. Sometimes willpower and the mysterious machinery of the human spirit can overcome what science suggests is impossible. But Catherine knew exactly what had happened. She had memories of being in that dark place, of voices reaching through the darkness. One voice in particular that spoke to her with such gentleness, such humanity, that it had pulled her toward the light. She hadn't known who it belonged to until the day she was discharged and Marcus came to say goodbye. Standing awkwardly in the doorway, with that same exhausted vulnerability she remembered, from a place she shouldn't remember at all. "You were there," she said simply. "You talked to me. You treated me like a person, not a business problem that needed solving." Marcus was startled. You were in a coma." I just did what anyone should do." Catherine smiled. And in that smile was the entire trajectory of what her life had become, the fortune, the power, the influence, all of it suddenly feeling hollow compared to this. Man's simple act of human kindness. She had built an empire, and no one had ever saved her life. Then this young doctor, with the coffee-stained coat, changed her bandages and spoke to her like she mattered. Within a year, Catherine had redirected millions into medical education, funding scholarships for doctors like Marcus, who believed that medicine was about more than procedures and prescriptions. She endowed ICU recovery programs, advocated fiercely for nurse staffing standards, and became an unexpected voice in healthcare policy reform. Marcus never became famous from his actions. He continued his work at the hospital, continuing to treat every patient in a coma as though they might be listening, speaking to them with the same tenderness he'd shown Catherine. He never told the story of that night to anyone, never sought recognition or reward. But on a cold November evening, years later, he received an invitation to a gala. When he arrived, Catherine was there, standing tall and radiant, recounting to a room full of prominent philanthropists and policymakers the story of a young doctor who had changed her bandages and changed her life. She spoke about how one person's simple choice to see the humanity in another, even when that humanity seemed lost, could reverberate through the universe in ways we can never predict. "I was a woman with everything," Catherine said, her voice steady and true. "I had money and power and influence, but I had no one who cared whether I lived or died. I had no one who would sit with me in the darkness. This man did, and that act of human kindness became the lens through which I now see my entire existence. If we're not using what we have to help others see the light in the darkness, then what is it all for?" That night, as Marcus stood on the terrace looking out at the city lights, Catherine joined him and simply took his hand. No words were necessary. In that gesture was gratitude and respect and the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts contain the greatest power. Sometimes a young doctor with nothing but his humanity can restore a life, and in restoring one life, he restores faith in the very essence of human goodness itself.